Hello, my name is Paul Burston. I grew up in a small town in South Wales called Bridgend. Bridgend is famous for two things, rugby and teenage suicides. I was never very good at rugby, but I very nearly became a teenage suicide. I realized I was gay very young and I had a very hard time of it growing up in a town like that. I left when I was 19. I moved to London where I studied and I also came out. I left college at 22 and I had vague ambitions of being involved in the theatre. A very close friend who was a few years older than me suddenly was diagnosed HIV positive and became ill with AIDS. And my life changed direction completely. I put everything else aside and became an AIDS activist. I spent several years in a group called ACT UP London, which was a direct action group. And through activism, I kind of stumbled into journalism because I learned very quickly that the only way to ensure that the stories that we wanted to be told in the media, the way we wanted them to be told, was to tell them myself, and started freelancing for initially the gay press, then a magazine called City Limits, and then Time Out. I also wrote for a variety of newspapers and magazines, The Guardian, The Face, Sunday Times magazine, a whole load of different publications. And during that period, which was the sort of early 90s, I started to dream again of being a writer, which I'd always had this ambition as a child. And finally, it felt like something I could actually do because people were already paying me to write words. So I submitted an idea for a book. I'd recently gone back to university and studied for a master's degree in drama and film. I wrote my thesis on representations of homosexuality in mainstream Hollywood cinema and had the idea to expand this into an anthology with various other writers and took it to Routledge. It was called A Queer Romance and it came out in 1995 and quickly became a sort of set text in the early days of what we now call queer theory. From there, I published several other non-fiction books, and my editor at the time, a guy called Andrew Willey, suggested that I write a novel next. And I didn't really have an idea for a novel, but he did. He wanted somebody to write a gay version of Bridget Jones. That was how it was pitched to me. So I had the idea of turning this on its head and writing a book in which the male character, the gay male character, was the central character, and the straight female friend was the shoulder to cry on. So I wrote this story called Shameless, which was my first novel. After Shameless, I wrote three more rom-coms, and increasingly they became darker and darker and darker until I realized I didn't really want to write rom-coms anymore. I wanted to write something different. And for the last few years, I've been a crime fiction writer. I knew I wasn't quite right from an early age. My mother knew, but did the best she could. The other kids knew and tried to beat it out of me. They failed. As a small boy in small-town South Wales, I never learned how to fit in. I was always the last to be picked for team sports, the first to be singled out as gay, the last to defend myself when cornered in the playground or at the school gate. I was the boy who didn't fight back. Not then, not like that. As a teenager, I stopped trying to blend in and began to embody what queer theorists call cultures of resistance. In other words, I wore my queerness like armor, experimenting with outlandish clothes, hair dye, and makeup. But it was the early 1980s. Gender bending was all the rage. My effeminate appearance had unexpected consequences. It attracted girlfriends. Suddenly, I was both standing out and fitting in, and still not out of the closet. My mother wasn't fooled. To her, my appearance was proof that I wasn't quite right in the head. The same applied to my sense of humour. A good joke would kill you, she'd say, as I roared with laughter at Kenny Everett or Horror of Horrors' Spitting Image. Despite my academic achievements, I was the first person in my family to go to university. This feeling of being not quite right never left me. And this was before I finally came out as gay and faced the rejection many young LGBTQ+ people experience from their own families. I grew up in a house without books, in which homosexuality was only ever mentioned as the butt of jokes on TV or the subject of some scandal in the tabloid newspapers my stepdad read at the breakfast table. There were no gay characters on soap operas when I was a child, no Beautiful Thing, no Queer as Folk, no Glee, and certainly no social media to connect me with like-minded people and assure me that I wasn't alone. Cruelly, the sense of isolation you feel as a young LGBTQ+ person is often magnified by those closest to you. You're a stranger to yourself and to your own family. Growing up in a predominantly white working-class community, two of my school friends were a young boy from Uganda and a lad whose father came from Iraq. Both boys experienced racism at school, but neither feared going home to their parents and explaining why they were being bullied. When I was bullied, I kept it to myself. Unless you're one of the lucky ones, LGBTQ+ people grow up fearing that as soon as your parents discover you're different, they'll reject you. I certainly did. So you try to hide who you are. You repress your feelings and shroud your sexuality in shame. This causes psychological damage. Your sense of otherness festers and grows. Some people never fully recover from it, but become self-loathing, self-harming, self-medicating, or suicidal. Like many gay teenagers, I contemplated suicide. I self-medicated for years. Internalized homophobia is something I've worked hard to overcome. This is my lived experience and the experience of many other LGBTQ+ people. This is where we're coming from. We know what exclusion feels like. We're familiar with the ways in which words can be used as weapons and the wounds they can inflict. We know that people don't always say what they mean or mean what they say. So when someone says, "You're not quite right for us," we interpret those words through years of alienation, otherness, and rejection. When I was growing up, a popular euphemism for being gay was "one of them," as in, no, he hasn't got a girlfriend, he's one of them. The words are whispered in hushed tones, with an emphasis on them to indicate how strange and distasteful such people were. So if people like me are them, then who are we? Can this division be breached? Can one of them ever truly become one of us? Exclusion isn't always explicit. The words aren't always said directly. In the same way, many white people are unaware of or defensive about the idea of white privilege. Many heterosexuals are unaware or defensive about the notion of straight privilege. I still hear well-meaning heterosexuals suggest that it's easy to be gay now, as if homophobia ceased to exist when legal equality was achieved, making it safe for me to walk the street hand in hand with my same-sex partner. If only this were true, but it so often isn't, even now, even in a big city like London. People like me don't take public space for granted. We know it's not always safe out there. We've got the message. We've had it punched and kicked into us. The writer and AIDS activist Larry Kramer once said that straight liberals were gay people's worst enemy because they helped maintain the illusion of tolerance. I disagree. In my opinion, we need all the allies we can find, but they need to be willing to do the work. It shouldn't be left to LGBTQ+ people to educate and explain ourselves all the time, any more than it should be left to Black people to talk to white people about race. Tolerance isn't the same as acceptance, and acceptance isn't the same as inclusion. All too often it leads to tokenism. Here's an example. A gay male friend of mine on a national newspaper once attended an editorial meeting and suggested they run a piece about a reported rise in homophobic hate crimes. His suggestion was rejected on the grounds that we ran a gay story last week. The story they'd run the previous week was an interview with the singer Boy George. The message was loud and clear. Some gay stories were acceptable, others weren't suitable for a national newspaper. This is tokenism, plain and simple. I've been a journalist for 30 years and an author for almost as long. Back in 2007, I published my third novel with a mainstream publisher. Before writing fiction, I published several non-fiction books, including an academic anthology about queerness and popular culture, a pop biography, and a book of travel writing. I was 12 years into my career as a published author, but in all that time, I'd never once been invited to take part in a book festival. Now that I'm working on my 7th novel, and have also edited 2 short story collections, I've had plenty of time to think about why this might be. It seems to me that gay fiction is acceptable to the people who make these decisions, provided it's deemed to be literary enough. But who decides what is and isn't literary? And why should LGBTQ+ writers be obliged to write in any given style? Our lives, experiences, methods of storytelling, and styles of writing are as varied and as valid as anyone else's. It was out of this frustration that I launched the Polari Literary Salon in 2007. Polari is a live showcase for LGBTQ+ writers of all descriptions at any stage of their career. It began small, in the upstairs room of a bar in Soho, and grew quickly, moving to 2 other West End venues before settling in at the South Bank Centre in 2009. We also tour regularly. We've performed in theatres, libraries, art centres, pubs and nightclubs, and are equally at home in the Royal Festival Hall and the Royal Vauxhall Tavern. We've even performed on a racecourse. From the outset, I had a very clear idea of what Polari should be: accessible, lively, inclusive. I also had a strong sense of what it shouldn't be: dry, solemn, exclusive. With apologies to Oscar Wilde, I pity any poor man or woman trapped at an author event where everyone is self-important and over-earnest. Literary events can and should be fun. Laughter needn't denote a lack of seriousness. As Wilde also wrote, "If you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they'll kill you." At the risk of killing my chances of ever being invited to a book festival again, the truth is that far too many of them fall into the same trap, whereby authors and audiences alike are drawn from the same narrow social demographic. I wanted Polari to embrace everyone, writers of all ages, races, and genders, from all classes and cultural backgrounds, working in a wide variety of genres. There's no point in creating a live literary platform in the name of diversity if it doesn't reflect the diversity within the communities it's supposed to represent. Part of Polari's remit is to encourage and nurture new talent. Over the years, we've hosted some extraordinarily gifted writers, many of whom are just starting out and have never read their work in public before. We offer them a supportive space in which to showcase their work, alongside some of the biggest names in the LGBTQ+ literary world. So it seemed only natural that in 2011 we launched the Polari First Book Prize for new LGBTQ+ writing. The prize is open to writers born or based in the UK and Ireland, whose first book explores LGBTQ+ themes. All kinds of books are eligible, from debut novels to volumes of poetry, fiction or non-fiction, memoirs, graphic novels, and more. We've had a wide range of winners: memoirist James Maker, poet John McCulloch, novelists Salim Haddad, Paul McVeigh, and Fiona Mosley, crime writer Mari Hanna, short story writers Kirsty Logan and Dirie Osman. In 2019, we added a second Polari Book Prize for non-debuts, which was won by poet Andrew Macmillan. In 2020, the prizes were won by Amru Al-Qadi and Kate Davis. We're unable to attract a major corporate sponsor, relying instead on the generosity of our PR company, FMCM Associates, and my agent at DHH Literary Agency to provide prize money. The prize itself is run entirely voluntarily and involves an ever-increasing amount of work. This can't be right. Surely the UK's only book prize dedicated to LGBTQ+ writing is worth more than this. Or are we still not significant enough for the corporations regularly awarded prizes for their commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion? I realise, of course, that as soon as you run your own literary salon and create a book prize, you've automatically become one of the gatekeepers in some people's minds. No longer them, now us. Maybe there's some truth in this. All I can say is that the prize has an independent panel of judges, and that I'm every bit as dedicated to supporting new talent now as I was 14 years ago when Polari first began. In many ways, I'm still a stranger here myself. The worlds of journalism and publishing are both far more middle class now than they were when I first started out. Yet, despite running my own literary salon, founding a book prize, publishing over a dozen books, and thousands of newspaper and magazine articles and reviews, I have never been invited to judge any other book prize. Not once. Why not? I wish I knew. Maybe the time will come when there are no gatekeepers, no us and them, when we're all equal and have the same opportunities and nobody is made to feel as if they're not quite right. Until then, I'll continue as I am, one of them, one of us, doing what I can and hoping it makes a difference.
About myself and my work. Well, I suppose one thing to say would be to say that I was born in Johannesburg. My parents were both from Cape Town, and just those two facts are quite particular. And this was during apartheid, probably during the worst years of apartheid, in that I grew up, I was about 5 years old at the time of the Soweto uprising. Then my parents moved to Canada briefly, and then we returned to South Africa. And I lived there throughout what was called the emergency period, which in a sense was really a time of revolution, a kind of low-intensity civil war, I think would be the military term for it, in which people were being killed and imprisoned daily, and yet other people were sort of living what they thought were normal lives. So it was a strange circumstance to grow up in, but it was also an interesting circumstance in that things were political in very striking ways, especially thinking about economics. Marxism was really the principal ideology of the left wing in South Africa, and then there was also a Africanist vision for the country. So if you could go beyond like this kind of white idea of what the country was, there was a larger world that you could imagine yourself being part of, a kind of a socialist, Africanist universe. And then also there was left-wing Afrikaans literature, which was very interesting to me because it was actually very powerful and very interventionist and also very nuanced as a tradition. So I was quite interested in that, as well as reading African poets in translation and European poets in translation, and a small number of English language poets. Then, as a family, we moved to Australia, and that was a shock. To live in Perth is a shock and remains a kind of a shock. And so I started reading a lot. Again, continuing that kind of reading I was doing then, and I was writing poetry kind of shaped by translation, especially sort of European poets, post-war poets, surrealist poets. But then I started engaging deeply with Australian poetry, and also with this predicament of Australian culture, which is like, what kind of colonial culture is Australian culture? You know, if South African culture was in a civil war on the verge of being post-colonial, what kind of a culture was Australia, or is Australia? And ultimately I found that to be a kind of a futile quest. And so I became much more drawn to thinking about the outside world, about the countries neighbouring Australia, in particular at the start Indonesia, about which I wrote a prose book and also some early poetry. And then I returned to South Africa for a visit, and I wrote a small book of poetry that opened up a lot of things for me. And then I later had the opportunity to go to Japan to follow up my interest in Shinto and Buddhism, which had actually been sparked by the poet Breitenbach, the Afrikaans poet, and convicted terrorist in those days. So that started my sort of about 15 to 18 years of travel, where I was traveling pretty much every year and usually writing something in relation to that. But I think this idea of traveling is very important, and I think it's important to keep in mind the metaphor of the traveller. What is the idea of the traveller? And I'm often drawn to thinking about people who have no home, you know, like, what am I in relation to people who have no home? And when I think of people who have no home, of course you think of refugees, you think of displaced people, you think of people who have been forced out of their homes, having their houses burnt down. And then I also think of it in a spiritual way, in a Buddhist way. But I mean, this is true of other traditions, but in particular the Buddhist way, which is to think of the practice of thinking about the spiritual is to leave your home, is to leave the comfort of what you know, is to leave those things that you think are completely reliable, and to go out into a world that makes you find another level of reality. My communist friend, for Walter Famler. Later, in Vienna, my friend the communist would tell me of his own lost love, how he had followed her to Istanbul, only to find out that she was from one of those families, daughter of a millionaire. He had tried to be an agitator there, was involved with the Kurdish Workers' Party up in the mountains, travelled with a pistol in his rucksack. Years later, when he returned to Istanbul for a conference, she agreed to meet and picked him up from his hotel in her limousine. His colleagues were impressed. He had been the lover of the woman, now president of Turkey's Chamber of Commerce. When they had broken up, he had tried to join a Sufi monastery. My friend, the communist, believes his life could have been very different. He could have been a millionaire. Maybe you should try the Sufis again. I can't. Once refused, always refused.
People often ask me to talk about writing, what type of writer I am. And I always tell people that I'm a literary activist. And just take a second or a minute to explain what that is. I've been using the term for the last several years. Instead of being associated with an institution or organization, I prefer to be linked to the work I do. I was an activist before I was a writer. My activism began in 1968 when I arrived on the campus of Howard University. As a literary activist, I see myself as a cultural worker. My primary goal is to use culture to bring people together. Cultural bridge building and networking are important to me. Like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, I believe in the beloved community. If today we look around and cannot find this type of inclusive community, then one's duty is to work to bring it into existence. I believe in a common language between people. As a literary activist, I believe in the need for a literary community and strong support of literary organizations by making financial contributions. Collaborating with other artists, such as musicians, painters, and filmmakers, is also a priority, as is the creation of new work that is uplifting and visionary. As a literary activist, I recognize there are times when I must speak and work for those who have no voice or who are unable to read or write. I want to live in solidarity with nature and all that is good and yes in the world. A cruel nakedness. When money was just as good as cash, we sat by the curb and shook our cups. We held signs against our chests. Signs with words no one took time to read. It was as if we were writers hanged upside down after a revolution. Our bodies twisting between the earth and sky as if the old order of things could once again survive or take flight. A few coins placed in a hand becomes the first line of a prayer. A glance or hello is a hymn of salvation. But each day, we fail to return kindness to the world. Strangers past strangers, afraid of blood or bond. There's a cruel nakedness among people that is already visible to the touch. How alone we live before we die.
At the moment, I live in the goldfields of central Victoria, and it's a place that was really churned up and cleared in the 19th century for what we could extract from it. And in a sense, really, it's a place that now reminds me of the resilience and strength and persistence of people, because it's a place that the land, the country continues. And it's cared for, particularly by the local Indigenous people, but it's beginning to come back to itself in a precarious way, because we're precarious. But it's a reminder that sometimes beauty and strength and insight is actually very subtle, and we don't always notice it. Sometimes we have to sit and wait for it to materialize for us. Over the course of my life so far, I've worked in call centres, in libraries. I ran a cafe for a couple of years. I've been unemployed, but at the moment I'm basically working as a poet and a creative writing teacher and mentor. What really got me into poetry in the first place as a 20-something person was being aware of being physically different. So I have a genetic condition called Marfan syndrome. For me, that has meant not just being tall and thin, but having spinal curvature. And growing up, of course, that means being identified as different, being stared at and pointed at. And that certainly made me self-conscious and made me think about whether I belong in the community, in the world. But it really made me think about what is it that causes that distinction between normal and different, between able and disabled. You know, why do we have this distinction and why do we treat people as other? So poetry for me has been a way to speak back to those myths and to really express who I am and I guess complicate people's ideas of what they think otherness is. There's a lot of assumptions around pain, around inspiration, around happiness that really don't bear much relation to the complex reality of what it means to be human with a disability or with deformity. So that's kind of where I'm coming from as a writer. And it's exciting for me at the moment to be exploring not just what I know in terms of my own experience and what insights I gain from being on the outside, but also exploring what I don't know, to think about my own privilege, to think about the things that I'm unaware about other people's lives, and still trying to draw some kind of affinity and solidarity with the struggles of others, so that really it's not just about me, it's about all of us. The hill is everywhere beyond my front door, and what I carry can never be put down. It's hard to remember a time when this weight was separate from my body. Aware it's being watched, the skin grows quickly over a burden, hardens like a myth, but keeps its sensitivity. There's a constant hum in my inner ear, and my nervous system is awash with fatigue. The enduring task is to leave the house, practice the art of oblivion, as if that could deflect your attention. At least it's exercise, or rehearsal. For what, I'm not sure. Am I lifting history, your thoughts of me? The hill could be the entire human world. The hill could be my shame, steadfast and cumbersome. Each morning I wake spent, begin again, scale and descend, the steep face of my appearance. Who else clambers up this fateful inclination, assumes this otherness? At the summit, breathless, alone, all I can do now is take it in, the vertiginous outlook I never asked for. I have left these impressions in the earth. I will be followed.
Hello, I'm Olive Sr., and I'm so happy to be part of this 10th anniversary celebration of Speaking Volumes, and also to have this opportunity to spend some time with you. I'm recording this in Kingston, Jamaica, where I've just been named Poet Laureate for 2021 to 2024. And part of my focus will be to encourage the nation in the reading and writing of poetry that speaks to the land. And I hope to use ecopoetics to encourage greater awareness, especially among the young, of the need to protect, care for, and assume ownership of our natural resources. And I want to encourage this by starting in our own small corner or yard, as we say in Jamaica, as a way of reducing our enormous global responsibilities down to a manageable level. I've always believed in bigging up the small, such as my signature poems that deal with the things in nature that we tend to ignore or take for granted, such as yard fowl or snails or weeds, for instance. So my efforts as Poet Laureate will be to encourage as a starting point the gaze at eye level with the slogan, I see my land. I spent my childhood in rural Jamaica, so an appreciation of the natural world is, in a sense, embedded in my DNA. And this interest is manifest in virtually all of my writing, whether fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and in children's literature, especially in my book, Anna Carries Water. But I'm particularly interested in the role and in the role that historical and political circumstances play in our increasing disregard for nature, the link between imperialism and environmental destruction, which is I've most fully interrogated in my poetry book, Gardening in the Tropics. I'm privileged to live in two countries, Canada and Jamaica, but above all, I regard myself as a global citizen because more than ever are signs that our fates are inextricably intertwined, yesterday, today, and forever. My latest book, Pandemic Poems, tries to contextualize our global our global response to a health crisis, but also suggests ways we as writers can call attention to our growing responsibilities to Mother Earth through using the poet's vision of the slanted eye. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to wave from my yard to yours and to say, let us walk good on this earth together. Thank you. Not quite right for us. I have encountered these words so many times in the publishing world where they're usually tossed around, but they haven't left much of a mark on me. I have come to conflate this phrase with another, this just won't do, both spoken by a particular kind of gatekeeper, and for me, since childhood, both forming the pivot on which resistance turns. Yet, I had no idea how deeply entrenched this resistance is in me until I started to think about the phrase. This led me to see how many times in my poetry and fiction my speakers have resisted both these notions without conscious thought, I'd like to say, on the part of the writer. People frequently ask me if I'm the child in these stories, and of course I deny it, as I believe all writers should deny any connection with their characters. But now I'm at an age where I can confess that while the characters are not me and the stories are not mine, they certainly embodied my own lifelong impulse to subvert authority, to challenge fake respectability, to shrug off the gatekeepers of personhood, history, and story. This is what has enabled me to endure a lifetime of writing and publishing on my own terms. My usual mental response to not quite right for us being a resounding, no, it is not. This started with requests to rewrite the Jamaican Creole in my first story collection, Summer Lightning, in standard English to make it suitable. And it was finally published without changes by Longman. and Summer Lightning went on to win the first Commonwealth Writers' Prize. It is the quiet in that phrase that annoys me, as does the suit in the similar "this just won't suit." Quiet seems a sort of word that would be used only by certain people, implying, as it does, queuing, quality, qualifications, inquisition, and the queue for the quiet sign warning you that in this hallowed place you are a barefoot mendicant among the besuited. Quiet is gatekeeper doublespeak with a snare that is absent from the straightforward "not right for us," spoken with a particularly plummy accent, and one that has silenced me since childhood, a polished accent of belonging that goes with a perfect place setting. And I can honestly say I have never wanted to sit in that place. Even without the accent, "not quite right" and "this won't suit" or "this just won't do" emanated from people who endorsed certain conservative expectations, especially of girl children at the time I was growing up, and the attributes that they valued, all outward expressions of conformity. Only much later, in adulthood, have I realized how suit is the operative word for the environment I grew up in, one in which appearance trounced substance, where outward respectability masked inner hunger or wicked desires in the rush to be the good colonial subject, where children were groomed and socialized to be right and ripe for the world that awaited, one that imposed a false identity that had nothing to do with us, as I noted in my poem, Colonial Girls' School, since it told us nothing about ourselves. There was nothing about us at all. This poem upset at least one former principal of my girls' school and some of my peers, who see it as slander on that excellent institution, but they miss the point entirely. I was writing about not one, but all our schools, girls and boys, and the curriculum at the time, which was that of English grammar schools. I have said often that I am thankful for the excellent education and the rigorous intellectual grounding that I and people of my generation received from these schools. The critique is not of what was there, but of what was missing, forcing us to fit into a suit not quite right for us because of, let us say, the poor sizing, the lack of detailing, wrong or missing buttons, sewn-up pockets, perhaps the unsuitable color or threadbare finish. Colonial Girls' School remains one of my most popular poems. What is sad is that although it was written so long ago, when I've had the temerity to say to schoolgirls today, I was writing about my time. I am glad that things have changed with a Caribbean-oriented curriculum, among other things. They quite often assure me, nothing has changed, miss. A lot has changed in our post-independence Caribbean and in our schools, but nothing has changed in our inability to cast off the deep-seated colonial trappings that still reinforce value in the metaphorical suit over the healthy development of the inner life, suit as straitjacket. Mental slavery now is underscored by a new form of colonization. Witness the widespread influence of American Christian fundamentalist religion, which, for instance, in some schools, is placing girls in ankle-length uniforms, inches longer than those we had to wear generations ago in our colonial girls' school. My poem, though, ends on an optimistic note, for Isn't it strange how northern eyes in the brighter world before us now pale? Pale northern eyes is referenced earlier in the poem. How those pale northern eyes and aristocratic whispers once erased us. How our loudness, our laughter debased us. As a child growing up in a world of mostly dark-eyed people, I genuinely associated pale northern eyes with the other, though in retrospect, it cannot be the eyes alone, but what they represented, since my father and most of my siblings have light-colored eyes. But the fading influence of the iconic northern eyes marked our emergence into self, my peers and I, as we stepped out into the world. That was true of those of us who hadn't entirely bought into wearing the metaphorical suit anyway, and many did. Since early childhood, I've known that I would be an artist, though what kind and how remained elusive since I had no mentors or guides. In a way, this has suited me, for it has enabled me to pursue my own erratic, bumbling, eccentric, sometimes painful but independent path, one in which not quite right for us can be easily deflected because there are so many paths to self-expression and self-affirmation. I am fully aware that this is not the path for everyone, nor am I advocating it, especially in today's world, where art is more than ever dominated by commercial considerations. Each of us has to decide which path we want to pursue. I like to think, though, that writers are wannabe alchemists, those sage magicians seeking to turn dross to gold, a lifelong striving that might end in futility. The gain is always in the process of finding out. So, if you receive a note saying, "Not quite right for us," it is not the end, merely the beginning. Thank you.